Welcome to Muswell Hill Baptist Church, where we're still only able to sing outside. And today we're singing Love Divine or Love's Excelling. Today we come to Genesis chapter 16.
Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered.
Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord said to her, You are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That's why the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael.
In a previous video that we'll mark at the end of this one, we looked at Genesis 15, verses 1 to 6, where Abram is given very precious promises by God. Abram responded with faith, some questions, but with faith. And chapter 15, verse 6, God credited that to him as righteousness. Faith is so important to God. He wants us to believe in his promises. So things are going very nicely at the beginning of chapter 16, but then they're not. Chapter 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. The old problem is still there. Sarai is trying every month with Abram for her child, we presume, and the months go by and the years go by, and she was old when this all started, ridiculously old to have a child, and now she's ridiculously old plus 10 years. Sarai has had enough, and we're going to look at the three people in this story briefly now. Sarai, Abram, Hagar. And we're going to think about what it means for faith. Because in this chapter, the great faith we saw in the previous chapter seems to be faltering. First, let's think about Sarai. Sarai, who said, perhaps I can. She had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Perhaps I can. If God can't do it, or won't do it, I can perhaps do it. This is a sad glimpse as to what slavery means, by the way. It is when someone is so owned that they can simply be the surrogate womb for their mistress. But this, of course, would have been very common throughout the world those thousands of years ago. Faith is so often about waiting. It is about trusting God. And when we cannot make things happen, trusting for him to happen. And not just trusting, but praying. So much prayer is about trusting in God. Praying perhaps for many, many years for a loved one who is very antagonistic to faith. Praying for a neighbor who is very unwell. Praying for a church that appears to be coming to the end of its time. Praying for a person who we find very, very difficult and who shows no sign of softening towards us. Praying, trusting in God. Praying for our country. Praying through a pandemic, which has certainly dragged on for very many months. And trusting in God. Praying in those last weeks of our lives, or will they be years, when there is not so much that we can actually do for ourselves, but praying and waiting and longing for the day. This is what faith is about. And Sarai, we don't know how strong her faith was to start with, but it's weakened this decade in. Nor should we think that if we try to make things happen for God, God will jump in response. God wants us to trust him. And a sneak preview of the distance into chapter 17 will show us that having tried her system that didn't work, Sarai has to wait more than another 10 years before the promise is fulfilled. God is in control. Secondly, let's think about Abram. Abram, who basically says to Sarai, over to you. At this moment, we would expect Abram, the man of faith, the prophet of God, as it were, to step in and put his wife to rights. Well, nothing of that sort happens. In one simple word, a fateful deal is struck. The Lord has kept me from having children, Sarai said. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. He agreed. Agreed is a lovely word, far better to agree than to argue, as a rule. But when we agree with another person, however dear and loved and partnered to them we are, but by agreeing to them we are disagreeing with God, then there is trouble ahead. And there is, for Abram, Sarai, and others, trouble ahead from this moment. We remember that in the story of the Garden of Eden, the serpent got Eve to agree with him, and then Eve got Adam to agree with her. What a happy trio of agreement it was, but it was contrary to what God had said. You shall not eat of the fruit of that tree. And so the happy agreement turned into a disaster for us all. It's a challenge for the church and for Christians in their places of work, in their social culture, in the way they live their lives, and the way even that they talk to others. But we must be clear that we agree with God first, and we agree with others second. So the good news should be that Sarai's plan seems to work, and so there's a baby on the way. Now, whatever Hagar's relationship with Sarai had been before, maybe very courteous and obedient, maybe quite feisty, who knows? What happens now is that Hagar starts to make fun of Sarai. She's having the baby that Sarai couldn't have, poor old thing. What is Abram going to do? He's become part of this plan, and indeed Sarai makes that quite clear. You are responsible, she says in verse 5, for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now she knows she's pregnant. She despises me. Oh dear. So Abram is going to have to step in and sort the matter out. Or maybe not. Over to you, he says. Your slave, verse 6, is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best. Well, the clue is that Sarai hasn't thought best so far, and here she doesn't think best either, because what she actually does is take her revenge on Hagar, and with the power at her disposal as the slave owner, she ill-treats her, and Hagar flees away back towards Egypt, where she comes from. It's a mess. A pregnant woman in a desert, traveling on a long journey. She's going to be in total disgrace because there's going to be no known father of the child. The nearest equivalent to what Abram says to Sarai here is found in the New Testament. When Pontius Pilate had Jesus before him and could not get out of the dilemma of what to do with an innocent man who everybody seemed to want to be executed, he washed his hands of Jesus, where the expression comes from, and he handed Jesus over to them, just as Abram handed Hagar over to Sarai. It didn't work well then, and it never works when we abrogate our responsibility that God has given us to do what is right. Well, it's a terrible situation, all made by two people of faith whose faith faltered. We haven't heard much about God in this sermon so far, and that's because there's not much about God in the planning of Sarai and the agreeing of Abram. If we think that God doesn't notice when he's being left out, we make a big mistake. And so the narrative tells us the story of two people who frankly may as well have been atheists, who are making their plans because to them God has gone silent. But of course, God is everywhere. And even though it's not easy to find him in this chapter in the conversations between Sarai and Abram, when Hagar is alone in the desert, God is found, or more correctly, God finds her. Verse 7, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she said. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much, they will be too numerous to count. It's a wonderful promise in a desperate circumstance. Why does God send her back to her cruel mistress? Well, really, she's being sent back to Abram. And at the end of the chapter, Abram has to face up to the fact that he is the father. So Hagar bore Abram a son, verse 15. And Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So Abram's going to have to face up to the fact that he has agreed with Sarai, he has made the arrangement, and now he has his first son, who nevertheless is not the son that God promised. God, far from covering it up, makes Abram face responsibility for what he has done. In that desert, Hagar has that most amazing experience that she memorializes. She gives a name to God. The God who sees me. I have now seen the one who sees me. What an amazing experience in the desert to see heaven come down, to experience the sense of God's presence in a desperate and dark situation. At the end of this chapter, everyone has run away. Sarai has run away from the promise. Abram has run away from his responsibilities, and Hagar has run away from an abusive family. The only one in this chapter who doesn't run away is God. It's worth remembering.